The restaurant buzzed with soft chatter and the clinking of glasses, its polished wooden tables illuminated by warm, golden lights. Sarah sat at the table, the picture of elegance, her laughter bright and contagious as she bantered with her friends. On her left sat her husband, Daniel, the type of man who naturally exuded reliability and warmth. Their circle had gathered, Daniel's friends intermingling with Sarah's closest confidants, a lively lunch designed to deepen bonds. Honestly, Daniel, Sarah teased, taking a sip of her Chardonnay, if you and your friends keep swapping sports stories, we might as well declare it a club meeting. Laughter rippled across the table. Michael, one of Daniel's best friends, leaned in. We can't help it, Sarah. Old habits die hard. It was a pleasant scene, one of camaraderie and cheer. Yet, just below the surface, a current of tension brewed. Sarah's smile lingered a little too long when Michael spoke. Her playful elbow jabs and sly winks seemed meant for more than just friendly fun. Later, as the lunch wound down, Sarah announced, I had such a lovely time. Maybe we should make this a regular thing. Everyone murmured their agreement. As the group dispersed, Sarah took a moment to catch Michael by the arm. Daniel, engrossed in a conversation with another friend, didn't notice as Sarah whispered something to Michael. Their laughter was muted, their exchange seemingly innocent, but the unspoken understanding between them hung in the air. Back at home, Daniel looked across the kitchen at Sarah as she unpacked the leftovers. I think today was a success, he remarked. You and Michael were getting along well? Sarah's smile was flawless. He's easy to talk to. You've got good taste in friends. The following week, Sarah found herself at the cafe where she often met her friends. It was her sanctuary, a place where life's complications could be drowned out by the aroma of coffee and the chatter of patrons. But today wasn't an ordinary meetup. Today, she was here with a purpose. As her friend Natalie stirred her latte, Sarah leaned closer, her voice dropping conspiratorially. You know, Michael is quite charming. Natalie raised an eyebrow. Michael? As in Daniel's friend? What about him? Oh, nothing serious, Sarah replied, feigning casualness. We just talked a little after lunch last week. He's funny, isn't he? Natalie sipped her drink, studying Sarah's face. He's okay. But why are you bringing him up? Sarah shrugged, twirling her spoon. No reason. He just stood out, that's all. It was an innocuous conversation on the surface, but Sarah's mind churned with calculation. That moment at the restaurant, Michael's lingering glances, his sly remarks, had sparked something in her, a thrill she hadn't felt in years. Later that afternoon, when Daniel texted that he'd be working late, Sarah saw her opportunity. Picking up her phone, she scrolled to Michael's name, recently saved from a group chat. Sarah. Hi. It's me, Sarah. Just wanted to thank you again for the laughs last week. You made lunch so much fun. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the send button, but as her heart raced, she hit it. The reply came quickly. Michael, hey Sarah. Nice to hear from you. Last week was great. What's up? She felt a rush of excitement. Keeping the tone light, she responded, not much. Just thinking it'd be nice to catch up one-on-one sometime. Daniel doesn't need to know. It's harmless, right? The three dots indicating Michael's typing felt like an eternity. Michael, I don't see why not. When? Sarah's lips curved into a smile. The game had begun. That weekend, Daniel was away on a work retreat, leaving Sarah with the house to herself. She had planned it perfectly. A harmless errand run was all the excuse she needed to step out unnoticed. Michael had suggested meeting at his apartment, citing privacy and comfort. She had readily agreed, telling herself it was just a friendly visit. As she drove to Michael's place, Sarah's mind raced. A part of her insisted she was doing nothing wrong. It was just a little fun, a break from the monotony. But another part, a quieter, guiltier one, nagged at her, whispering that this was dangerous territory. Michael greeted her at the door with an easy smile, dressed casually in a fitted shirt and jeans. You made it, he said, stepping aside to let her in. Sarah smiled, brushing past him. Of course. I couldn't back out now, could I? The apartment was tidy, with muted tones and simple decor. A bottle of wine and 2 glasses sat on the coffee table. Michael poured them each a glass, his movements confident and smooth. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Sarah felt herself relax in a way she hadn't in a long time. Michael's attention was undivided, his compliments unapologetically flattering. At some point, he leaned closer, his hand brushing hers. "You know, Sarah," he said, his voice low, "I've always thought you were stunning. Daniel's a lucky guy." Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. "You don't have to say that." "I don't say anything I don't mean," he murmured, his gaze locked on hers. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken intent. Then, almost imperceptibly, Sarah leaned in. It was a small movement, but it was enough. Michael closed the distance, his lips capturing hers. The kiss was electric, charged with the forbidden. Sarah knew she should stop, that this was crossing a line she could never uncross. But as Michael pulled her closer, she silenced the voice of reason screaming in her head. The kiss had unlocked something in Sarah, an intoxicating mix of excitement and danger she hadn't felt in years. When she finally left Michael's apartment that evening, she couldn't wipe the smile off her face, though a flicker of guilt gnawed at her. She told herself it was nothing more than a fleeting moment, a secret she could take to her grave. But secrets have a way of growing. The following week, Sarah continued her usual routines, though her phone seemed to buzz with more frequency. Each time it did, her heart would leap. "Michael, I can't stop thinking about you." "Sarah, me neither. But we need to be careful." They both agreed. Daniel couldn't find out. Yet, the thrill of their connection made Sarah reckless. She started carving out more time for Michael, using harmless-sounding excuses that Daniel didn't question. A week later, Sarah's friends, along with Daniel's group, gathered for lunch at the same restaurant where it had all begun. It was another lively afternoon filled with chatter and laughter, but Sarah felt hyper-aware of Michael's presence. They exchanged fleeting glances and subtle smiles across the table. Halfway through the meal, Sarah's friend Natalie noticed her distracted demeanor. "Earth to Sarah," she said with a teasing grin. "Where's your head today?" Sarah forced a laugh. "Sorry, just zoned out for a second." Daniel didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He was engaged in a debate with one of his friends, completely oblivious to the undercurrent running between his wife and Michael. As the group began to leave, Sarah lingered by the entrance, waiting for an opportunity. When Michael walked out behind her, she touched his arm. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "Your place?" Michael grinned. "You're getting bold." Sarah shot him a playful glare. "Just be ready." That night, back at home, Daniel was sprawled on the couch, watching a game. "Lunch was fun, wasn't it?" he said. "I'm glad you're getting along with everyone." Sarah nodded, her face carefully neutral. "It's nice to feel connected." But as she curled up on the couch beside him, she couldn't shake the sensation of walking on a razor's edge. She was confident Daniel didn't suspect anything, but how long could she keep this up? Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's secret visits to Michael became part of a carefully orchestrated routine. She always had an excuse ready, an errand, a yoga class, lunch with friends. To Daniel, her comings and goings seemed perfectly normal, but cracks were beginning to form in her facade, ones she hadn't noticed yet. Daniel, however, was starting to. It began with small, almost imperceptible things. Sarah laughing at her phone a little too often, her mood oscillating between giddy and withdrawn. Once, while they were watching TV, she got up to check her messages and returned looking distracted. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked. Sarah nodded quickly, avoiding his eyes. "Just Natalie. She's going through something." He didn't press further, but a seed of doubt was planted. One evening, while Sarah was out grabbing dinner with friends, Daniel decided to clean up their shared home office. It was a rare occurrence. Sarah was meticulous, and there was rarely anything to organize. But as he rearranged some papers on her desk, his eyes fell on her open laptop. It wasn't locked. He hesitated, guilt prickling at his conscience. He had never snooped on Sarah before, and he didn't want to start now. But curiosity, or was it worry, got the better of him. He clicked on her email, scrolling past innocuous messages from stores and newsletters. Then, buried halfway down her inbox, was an email chain with Michael. The subject line read, "Follow up from lunch." Daniel opened it, his breath catching. The first few messages were generic, friendly exchanges about the restaurant and mutual friends. But as he scrolled further, the tone shifted. Michael, can't stop thinking about last time. Sarah, me neither. You make me feel alive again. Michael, when can I see you? Sarah, tomorrow. Same place. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what he was reading. Was it just innocent flirting? Was he jumping to conclusions? No, something deeper was happening here. His instincts told him so. That night, when Sarah returned home, she greeted Daniel with her usual cheerful smile, but he couldn't bring himself to return it fully. You okay? She asked, placing her bag on the counter. Daniel forced a nod. Yeah, just tired. She kissed his cheek and went upstairs to change, but Daniel sat on the couch, his mind racing. He wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. He needed more than a string of emails. If she was hiding something, he was going to find out. The following days were a blur for Daniel. His mind oscillated between denial and suspicion, each nagging at him as he watched Sarah move through their shared life with unsettling ease. He didn't want to believe that the woman he had loved for so many years could be capable of such a betrayal. But the email exchange haunted him. The words burned into his mind. He decided to dig deeper. One evening, while Sarah was in the shower, Daniel found himself sitting at the dining table with her phone in his hand. She often left it unattended, and he had never felt the need to check it until now. His heart pounded as he unlocked it, guilt tugging at him even as his fingers moved. The messages on her phone appeared clean, almost too clean. But then he saw a thread under the name Melissa, one of Sarah's close friends. When he opened it, his stomach dropped. The texts weren't from Melissa. Michael, can't wait to see you tonight. Same time? Sarah, yes, can't wait either. I'll make an excuse about the gym. Daniel closed the app and set the phone back on the table, his hands trembling. Any lingering doubts had been obliterated. She wasn't just flirting. She was meeting Michael behind his back. The confrontation still didn't come. Instead, Daniel began to observe, his suspicions sharpening his senses. He noticed how Sarah's gym bag often seemed untouched when she returned from her workouts, how she avoided looking him in the eyes whenever he asked about her day. One Friday evening, Daniel pretended to leave for a late meeting, though he doubled back and parked his car a block away. He watched from the shadows as Sarah left the house, dressed casually, but with an effort that didn't align with a simple trip to the gym. He followed her, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as she drove across town. When she parked outside a modest apartment complex, he already knew whose door she would knock on. From the safety of his car, Daniel watched as the door opened and Michael greeted her with an embrace. They disappeared inside, the sight confirming what he had feared. His chest tightened with a mix of rage and heartbreak, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't the moment to act. He needed to be sure, and he needed proof. That night, Daniel lay awake in bed, his thoughts a tangled mess. Sarah lay beside him, sound asleep, her breathing steady. He couldn't reconcile the woman he loved with the one he had seen step into Michael's apartment. The time for confronting her was coming, but Daniel wanted to do it on his terms. And when he did, there would be no room for her to deny it. Daniel spent the next week preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He felt like an outsider in his own marriage, watching Sarah laugh, smile, and move through her days as though everything was fine. The disconnect between her outward demeanor and the betrayal he had uncovered left him oscillating between heartbreak and fury. On Thursday evening, Daniel left work early, telling Sarah he was running errands. Instead, he parked his car down the street from Michael's apartment. He had hired a private investigator after the emails and texts to confirm his suspicions, but now he wanted to see it with his own eyes. Around 6:30 p.m., Sarah's car pulled into the lot. She stepped out, glancing around nervously before hurrying to Michael's door. This time, Daniel didn't stay in the shadows. He parked a few spots away, got out of his car, and quietly followed her path to the apartment. He stood just out of sight by the door, straining to hear the muffled conversation inside. Laughter echoed through the thin walls, followed by footsteps moving toward the living room. As the voices grew softer, Daniel took out his phone and hit record. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. And then he opened it. The scene that greeted him was painfully predictable, but still gut-wrenching. Sarah and Michael sat on the couch, wine glasses in hand. Her hand rested on his thigh, her body angled toward him intimately. At the sound of the door, both of them froze. Sarah's face went pale. "Daniel?" Michael stood, his expression shifting from surprise to defiance. "What the hell are you doing here?" Daniel ignored him, his focus solely on Sarah. "I wanted to see how the gym was treating you." Her mouth opened, but no words came. Michael stepped forward, his voice rising. "You don't have the right to barge in here." "Don't even start," Daniel snapped, cutting him off. "This isn't about you." He turned back to Sarah, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "How long, Sarah? How long have you been lying to me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but Daniel had no sympathy left to offer. "Don't bother crying," he said coldly. "You weren't crying when you planned this, when you lied to my face." "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Don't insult me," Daniel said. He pulled his phone from his pocket, showing her the recording. "I've seen enough." Michael tried to intervene, stepping between them. "You've made your point. Now leave." Daniel glared at him, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'm leaving, all right. But Sarah, don't bother coming home." With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Sarah calling after him. He didn't stop, didn't turn around. By the time he reached his car, his hands were shaking, but his resolve was firm. He had his answer, and now his life would never be the same. The drive home was a blur for Daniel. His mind churned with anger, hurt, and disbelief. He had spent years building a life with Sarah, trusting her implicitly, and now that life felt like a lie. When he walked into the house, the silence was deafening. This was the home they had built together, filled with memories, and yet it felt foreign now, as if it belonged to strangers. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photos on the nightstand. There was one of their wedding day, Sarah's radiant smile, his arm around her, their faces full of joy and promise. It mocked him now. He couldn't sit still. He moved through the house, gathering anything that reminded him of Sarah's betrayal, clothing, mementos, even the wine glasses she'd bought for their special nights. By the time he finished, there were several bags stacked by the front door. As he worked, his phone buzzed repeatedly. Texts and missed calls from Sarah filled the screen. "Sarah, Daniel, please. Let's talk." "Sarah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Sarah, please answer me. I'm coming home." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he scrolled through the evidence he'd gathered over the past few weeks, the emails, the text threads, and now the video. It was all so clear, so damning. There was no room for excuses or denials. When the front door finally opened hours later, Sarah stepped inside, her face streaked with tears. She froze when she saw the bags. "Daniel," she began, her voice breaking, "let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," he said, his tone cold. "You've made your choices, Sarah, and now I'm making mine." "Please," she begged, stepping closer. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I love you. I don't want to lose you." Daniel shook his head, bitterness seeping into his voice. "Love? You call this love? Sneaking around with my friend, lying to me for weeks, months, maybe? That's not love, Sarah. That's betrayal." Her sobs grew louder, but Daniel stood firm. "I've already contacted a lawyer. You'll be hearing from them soon." "Daniel, don't do this," she pleaded. "We can fix this. I'll end it with Michael. I'll do anything." But Daniel's resolve didn't waver. "The only thing you can do is leave." He stepped aside, gesturing to the bags by the door. Sarah hesitated, as though she might try to fight him on it. But his expression made it clear there was no room for negotiation. Slowly, she began to gather the bags, her movements trembling. As she stepped out the door, she turned to look at him one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Daniel said nothing. He watched her walk to her car, close the trunk, and drive away. When the taillights disappeared into the night, he shut the door and locked it behind her. For the first time in weeks, the house was truly quiet. And for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to break. He sank to the floor, his chest heaving with sobs. It wasn't just the loss of Sarah that hurt. It was the loss of the life he thought they had, the future he'd imagined. But even through the pain, a small voice in his mind reminded him, this was the beginning of something new. The morning after Sarah left, Daniel woke to an empty house. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on him as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee. He had slept on the couch, unable to face their shared bed, and now every corner of the house seemed to echo with memories. But there was no time to wallow. He had decisions to make. Daniel spent the day contacting his lawyer to finalize the divorce proceedings. He provided all the evidence he'd collected, the emails, texts, and video. The lawyer assured him that the proof would streamline the process and protect his assets. There would be no drawn-out negotiations or attempts at reconciliation. After the call, Daniel focused on practical matters. He boxed up more of Sarah's belongings, placing them in the garage. He deleted her contact from his phone, blocking her number to avoid the constant flood of messages. He even deactivated his social media accounts for a while, unwilling to face the inevitable fallout when word of their split got out. By evening, Daniel had one more task to tackle. He called Michael. The phone rang several times before Michael's voice came through, wary and hesitant. "Hello? It's Daniel," he said bluntly. "I wanted to let you know that I'm filing for divorce." There was a pause. Then Michael said, "Look, man. Save it." Daniel cut him off. "I don't want your excuses, your explanations, or your fake apologies. You've already said everything I need to hear through your actions." Michael exhaled heavily. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Spare me," Daniel snapped. "You didn't just happen to carry on with my wife for weeks. You made a choice, just like she did. And now you'll both live with the consequences." Before Michael could respond, Daniel hung up, the sharp finality of the gesture giving him a fleeting sense of control. That night, Daniel allowed himself a small indulgence. He poured a glass of his favorite whiskey, sat by the living room window, and stared out at the quiet street. The weight of the day pressed on him, but beneath it, a strange sense of relief was beginning to take shape. The worst had happened, and he was still standing. He thought about the future, though it felt hazy and uncertain. He didn't know how long it would take to heal or what life would look like without Sarah. But he did know one thing. He was ready to move forward. Weeks passed, and Daniel began to adjust to his new reality. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence of Sarah's infidelity. She offered little resistance, her attempts to reconcile dwindling as it became clear Daniel wouldn't budge. The house, once filled with the routines and shared life of their marriage, felt empty but no longer unbearable. Daniel found solace in small victories, finally replacing the old sofa Sarah had loved but he had hated, reorganizing the garage, and painting the guest room a fresh, inviting color. Each change felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. One day, while jogging through the neighborhood, Daniel bumped into an old friend, Mark, from college. They hadn't seen each other in years, but the reunion was warm and genuine. Over coffee, Daniel opened up about what had happened. "Man, that's rough," Mark said, shaking his head. "But you know what? I always remember you as the guy who bounced back from anything. This'll be no different." Daniel smiled, appreciating the encouragement. He realized he had been isolating himself, avoiding friends and social settings to hide his pain. That was going to change. With Mark's invitation, Daniel joined a casual soccer league. He wasn't great, but the camaraderie and physical activity provided a much-needed escape. Slowly, he began to rebuild his social life, reconnecting with friends and making new ones. The simple act of showing up, to the field, to gatherings, to himself, became its own form of healing. Months later, the divorce was finalized. When Daniel received the official papers in the mail, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the document. It was the end of a chapter, one filled with love, betrayal, and heartbreak. But it was also the beginning of something new. He folded the papers neatly and placed them in a drawer. That evening, he went out with his soccer team to celebrate their latest win. As the group laughed and shared stories over beers, Daniel felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. As the months turned into a year, Daniel found himself in a place he hadn't thought possible: contentment. He had moved to a new apartment across town, filled with light and life, a space that was entirely his own. His work flourished, his social circle grew, and he even started traveling, a dream Sarah had always dismissed. The wounds of betrayal still lingered, scars that would always be part of his story, but they no longer defined him. Daniel had discovered something far more valuable in the aftermath of his pain: resilience. Life wasn't perfect, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.